So, what is the Trump Doctrine? That's the question that we're going to go over today because as we listen to Trump talk about everything from Canada to Greenland to Panama Canal to trade wars to the cartels in Mexico, what we see is a very, very different US foreign policy starting to emerge from anything that we've seen in, well, maybe ever in US foreign policy, but certainly quite a few decades. And it actually poses some really interesting questions. And so, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some of the most popular foreign policies throughout time. We're going to briefly go over what we're talking about when it comes to, Wilsonianism versus neoconservatism versus Bismarck versus expansionism, colonialism. And we're going to talk about how the Trump doctrine seems to differ from those. And we're going to use very, very specific examples with things like the question of Greenland, the question of the Panama Canal. And we're going to talk about the various ways that the Trump doctrine might be able to be defined and applied. And then, just for fun, we're going to engage in wild speculation. That's right, something that we typically don't like to do on this channel, but quite frankly, we just thought it would be fun to decide, like, what would it be like if the United States decided to go full American Warhammer 40,000, right? What happens if America just says, screw it, we're in charge now, we got the biggest economy, the biggest military, it is time to go full American Imperium? What would that look like? So that will be our fun discussion at the end that you're definitely not going to want to miss. But we're going to get to all of that and more coming up on this episode. I am your host, Nick Freitas. As you can see, still not in the studio because I'm in Richmond for the Virginia General Assembly session, which is interesting to say the least. We'll definitely get into more of that later. But in the studio is my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone. And we all know it is not true that we don't wildly speculate on this show because I'm usually here to do the wild speculation.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. And then, of course, our resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. How you doing, Christian?
I'm super excited for this episode. This is gonna, you know what reminds me the most of what we're about to talk about is our two-part series that we did on Rome.
Mm, yeah, except that this one we get to wildly speculate more,
Except
and
we
that's
get to
going to
be
be
Rome.
we get to be Rome. We get to be Rome. Oh, there once was a dream. Yeah, we're gonna talk about what it would look like if we decided to make America glorious again. All right, but before we get to all of that, we need to talk about something very, very important. If the America is going to go full Imperium, well, you want to look your best while you're doing it. And that's where True Classic comes in. Now, I cannot tell you how many episodes I have talked about how much I love True Classic tees and how much I love True Classic workout gears and how my wife was the first one to actually discover this and say, baby, you got to try this out. And I've talked about the button downs, right? And this right here is quite possibly my favorite button down shirt in my entire wardrobe. And this
First time
comes
I saw you in it, you picked me up from the airport and it was like, oh my gosh, she looks so hot.
guys, that right there, that's all the endorsement you need, right? If your lady likes it, then you want to wear it. But I'm going to tell you right now, I need to get more of these because I started noticing something as I was getting invited to go and talk on other podcasts, right? And I wanted to feel confident, I wanted to feel put together, I wanted to wear something that I knew my wife liked. I kept going to this one, and all of a sudden, I kept watching all these other podcasts. I'm like, oh. Man, I need to get some. I gotta need some more of these because I keep wearing the same shirt when I go on another podcast. Because again, guys, look, let's be honest. We like to feel confident. We like to feel like we're put together when we're wearing something. And because True Classic just fits the way it should, and because it feels good, like this doesn't just, look, I don't just think it fits right. This actually feels good to wear. And I hate wearing button downs. Like I am a t shirt guy through and through. But if I got to wear one, this is the one I want to wear. And I've already ordered more because they're just phenomenal. So go to trueclassic.com/Nick. Here's what I'm going to advise that you do. Now, if you want to try something out, great. You can buy one or two, sure. Or bundle. If you bundle, you're going to get a whole lot more for your money. They have some absolutely great deals at True Classic. I'm telling you right now, you're not going to be disappointed. True Classic now makes up like the vast majority of my wardrobe because it not only fits right, but it's comfortable. I love them. Trueclassic.com/Nick. Go on there, get some deals, get some bundles. Again, promise you, you're gonna love them. You're gonna love them. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into this. The first thing that I want to talk about is that we all know that Trump is very much unlike other presidents that we've had in the sense that he is willing to be far more let's say far more unpredictable in his negotiating tactics. Like I'm seeing this right now in the General Assembly. To give you an idea, I walked into the Finance Committee that I sit on, And we have this paperwork talking about how all the Trump tariffs could potentially negatively impact, the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I'm looking at some of this, or you know, areas that it could have impacts on within our economy. And I'm looking at this going, guys, you are analyzing the Trump tariffs as if he's going to implement all of these overnight on day one. What Trump does in many respects, it's not to say that he's afraid to implement tariffs. No, he will. He doesn't have a problem with it. But I do think that Trump understands on some level, at least I hope he does, that tariffs are not necessarily good for the economy, right? A tariff is just a tax on a foreign good. And so Americans would end up paying more for foreign goods. And so that's not in and of itself a good thing, right? But unfortunately, we have a lot of really, really poorly negotiated trade deals right now where we actually give better treatment to foreign goods than we do our own domestic ones. And that doesn't make sense either, right? If the goal is to get to free trade, which is just to say that Americans are able to produce and exchange in the ways that make the most sense for them, both from the industry perspective and the producer perspective, and also from the consumer perspective, that's a good thing. But right now we're getting raked over the coals. And that's one of the things that makes Donald Trump so frustrated is Trump's looking at it going, wait a second, we got the biggest economy in the world. We've got the biggest military. We've got all of the best bargaining chips you can possibly have. And yet we keep signing on to just absurdly ridiculous trade deals. Right. The reason why I bring that up is because you see this in the way that Trump threatens things and some of the things that he throws out there that might seem just outrageous. And every time he does it, the political establishment and left wing media lose their minds as if he's going to automatically implement all of this. But he doesn't. Some of it he might. He's throwing it out there as a possibility. And
It's
that's
the art of the
exactly what,
deal. It's the art
that's
of the
ex-
deal.
yes, it's exactly what you want in a negotiation. Someone even said is military operations off the table with like Panama or something. He's like, look, he goes, I'm not going to discuss that. I'm not going to discuss that. That's part of strategy. That's part of negotiation. But by the same token, when somebody said, okay, does the United States have a right to militarily take Canada? He goes, no, of course we don't have a right to do that. So right off the bat, you see, if anybody's willing to listen and interpret this reasonably, you see that Donald Trump is not some madman bent on conquest or world domination. But by the same token, he's willing to utilize the strengths of the United States as a negotiating tactic in order to get good deals for the United States. And this shouldn't come as a shock or a surprise to anyone. In fact, if anything, it's something that we should be happy about. But how do we contrast this, right? Why is it that some people flip out when they hear these things? And it's because there can be a negative application of some of this. So what we're going to do very briefly is we're going to go over some of the various, foreign policies is one way to put it, but it's a little bit broader than that. And so one of the things that we'll talk about, just because this is something that has been somewhat dominant in American foreign policy for some time, is what you might call the neoconservative or the Wilsonian approach to foreign policy. And in that, you see in American foreign policy where American leadership is defined as the United States utilizing its economic and military power in order to make the world safe for democracy. Right? This was a term that was popularized by Woodrow Wilson, but I would argue was one that neocons really picked up on. And what that kind of foreign policy was dominated by, in my opinion, and I'm happy to hear Christian and Tina's take on this as well, was this idea that the United States had a kind of moral responsibility as the leader of the free world in order to expend money and treasure in order to create democratic conditions in other countries. And the compelling US interest in that sort of dynamic was one, and I'm trying to be generous to it, just so we all know, because I am not a neocon, but I'm trying to be generous. I'm trying to be fair to them. The moral benefit was is that because freedom is good and because representative government is good, using military and economic force in order to create conditions where that can exist in other parts of the world is also good. That is a net moral benefit. And then the practical benefit to the United States, allegedly, would be that the more societies that operate under similar guiding principles as the United States, the safer and more prosperous the world would be. Right? That's what I'm going to call kind of the neocon or the Wilsonian philosophy was. Christian, Tina, do you guys got any problems with that?
No, I think this is actually a very important point that needs to be made here because I have seen so many people lately on X say things like, well, Trump is now going full neocon because he's talking about Greenland and Panama and Canada and some other stuff. No, expanding your country is not neoconservatism. If that was the case, Alexander the Great would be one of the greatest neocons in all of history. Genghis
Yeah.
Khan, neocon, right?
Yeah.
Charlemagne, neocon. Julius Caesar, neocon. Like, no, that is not what neoconservatism is. Neoconservatism is using government power, military force, our military force, to spread an ideology, not to spread a nation's borders, right? That's what empire building is. That's not what neoconservatism is. When Woodrow Wilson declared war, it wasn't just him, it was Congress, right? But when Wilson called for declaring war on Germany in 1917, he said so because he wanted, as you said, to make the world safe for democracy. He didn't say that we want to annex Schleswig-Holstein from Germany and
Alsace-Lorraine will be ours.
yeah, like I mean the French wanted Alsace-Lorraine, right?
Yeah.
That's like he wasn't saying that like the United States is going to seize German colonies in Africa or the Pacific. We didn't take anything from Germany. We declared war on the Central Powers because we wanted, in the words of Woodrow Wilson, to promote an ideology, liberal democracy. That's what we did. We were fighting against monarchical systems in Germany and Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire in order to turn Central Europe into a bunch of liberal democracies. And that worked temporarily until it didn't. And then there was round two. And then that worked, except, it didn't actually really work because half of Europe fell to the Marxists at the end of that. And then we had 40 years of communist states in Central and Eastern Europe.
Let's not get too far afield.
Sure,
here.
sure.
But you generally agree on the principle and the distinction
Yes,
between neoconservatives or Wilsonian.
Yeah, the point being, the TLDR on all of this is that neoconservatism is using military force and regime change to perpetuate the spread and promotion of an ideology, a system of government, a philosophy around the world, and that philosophy being liberal democracies.
Okay, so I think that's good. So that's a good distinction from what we're going to talk about next, which is what we might call expansionist philosophy. Now, there's a couple different versions of what you might call expansionist philosophy or empire building or whatnot. So, for instance, you have the sort of expansionism that you saw under like the Mongol Empire, where largest land empire in world history, they didn't have a great deal of interest in, say, micromanaging the various states that they had underneath them. It was this idea of creating vassals, which might be tax havens for the overall, Mongol, government or army or empire. It was about taking resources, but it wasn't necessarily about some sort of grandiose notion of exporting Mongol culture. It wasn't it wasn't this idea of we're going to come in and rebuild your thing. It was very simple. You can give us your city, or we can conquer it, rape, pillage, and burn it to the ground. Which would you prefer? Right. But it was this idea of expansionism is we are the dominant military power, and what you have is now ours. And we recognize that there's a benefit to keeping you as, again, a tax farm or a vassal state. Um, and so that's what you might call a fairly ruthless form of expansionism, where you now fall within our jurisdiction. And again,
It's
to the extent,
imperialism.
yeah, to the extent that you get any benefit, it's that the Mongol military will now protect its tax farm from anybody else that would try to exploit that tax farm. Would that be a fair?
I mean, it's also worth noting this form of foreign policy was the default for literally every corner of the world for all of human history until relatively very recently. This is
It's what you refer to as conquest
Yes.
ethic. It's like
Right.
those that have the capacity to engage in conquest, therefore have the moral authority to engage in conquest.
it's the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they
Yes.
must. And
Yes.
apply that to beyond just the level of individuals, apply that to nation states, empires, cultures, people. This is why, I mean, why did Alexander the Great invade Persia? Did he have a claim to the Persian throne? No, he had an army that he thought could defeat the Persians in battle, which he did repeatedly. And then he conquered the empire and then declared himself Shah and Shah because he
Yeah.
could. This is why for a long time we had this idea that territory can legitimately be taken by right of conquest. And this is not the case anymore in the post-war.
Well, it is the case like on Minecraft. It's definitely the case on
Well, and
Minecraft. That is exactly how it works.
one could argue that it is potentially coming back if you look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. Russia is basically saying, we own this territory in the Donbass and in southern Ukraine. Why? Because our military is parked there and they can't be
Okay,
dislodged.
but I want to make, again, I don't want to get too far afield. We need to get through these distinctions because there's a distinction there, right? Like most nations still require what we would call a casus belli, right? Like a cause to go to war, right? That's a and again, this is not a new concept. Rome was famous for always trying to come up with ways where, oh no, we're not
It's defensive.
engaging we're not engaging in expansive, foreign policy. Like you attacked us, and now we're just protecting our borders by expanding them and taking all of Gaul. But the point is that there's an expansionist form of conquest that really does look at your vassal states, and you don't really care about how they manage their internal affairs, provided that the taxes arrive on time. And that's one form of expansionism. Another form of expansionism is a little bit different, where you do go in and you expand borders and you expand territories, but you are also um, making a much more concerted effort to expand culture
Mhm.
and to incorporate to incorporate other peoples. This is kind of the imperial model into a
An identity.
yeah, an identity in a larger political organization, which is defining.
This is what the Romans did. The Romans
Yeah.
conquered, but they also converted. They made people into
Yes.
Romans. They made the Etruscans and the Samnites and the Greeks and the Gauls into Romans over time. Now, it's still bloody because it's conquest, right? Look at what Julius Caesar did in Gaul. It was very bloody, but the Romans were assimilators. And part of the reason that we don't look at this anymore is because there's a third form of it, which rarely popped up in history, but it did pop up in history. And the last time it popped up in history was the bloodiest war in human history, which is genocidal conquest.
Yeah.
This is what happened in Rwanda in the 90s, where you had ethnic groups that tried to just wipe each other out. This is what the Nazis attempted on the Eastern Front, where they tried to exterminate the Poles and the Russians and the Jews and all of these other Slavic peoples groups in Eastern Europe, where it wasn't just, we're going to take your land and turn you into vassals. No, if that was the strategy, they might have actually blown up the Soviet Union, because there were a lot of people that didn't like Stalin. But instead, their response was, we're going to conquer this area and you all can go to hell and we're just going to shoot you.
Yeah.
And that is very different than what the Romans did, which was assimilation, or what the British
and
did. And that wasn't always the case, but because of the fact that the last time that you had a major upheaval with international borders was World War II, we kind of associate the conquest ethic with genocide, when sometimes they do go together, but they don't always go together. And
No, I think it's important for people to understand, as you said earlier, that the conquest ethic was essentially the norm for the vast majority of human history. It really wasn't until you get into things like the Peace of Westphalia, where we talk about the concept of the nation state, where we start to work along these modern concepts of, again, the nation state, and then the post World War II order, where it was the idea that borders borders really don't change much, and to the extent that they do, they actually disintegrate from larger entities into smaller ones. And that's where you actually see the breakdown of, with respect to, like, the after the end of the Soviet Union, into again, various nation states then take form then, and you see it in other places as well. But to Christian's point, right? You've got kind of like these three various forms of an expansionist policy based somewhat on the conquest ethic. Again, one of them being very harsh. Other ones, not to say that it's less, not to say that it wasn't harsh in certain ways, but that were far more accommodating to various people groups. So when you look at the British Empire, that allowed for a certain degree of home rule, um, but also unity within the Commonwealth nations or the empire itself, et cetera. So you could have empires that were like more benevolent to populations which existed within it, right? And again, some people are going to take a lot of issue with me saying, using the word benevolent, because um, there's always instances of maybe harsh treatment or whatnot. But I'm just saying that there is. I promise you, there is a distinction between British imperialism and Mongolian conquest, right? Those things were different.
yeah,
And you could say the same thing about Persian conquest versus, Macedonian conquest, etc. Then you get into a couple of other foreign policies that we're going to discuss briefly. One is what we might call more of a libertarian, non-interventionist approach to foreign policy, which is essentially to say that you know the way I like to kind of like briefly define it is trade with everyone, war with nobody. So that's not to say that a non-interventionist foreign policy is one where you never go to war. You just don't go to war really for purposes of conquest. You certainly don't go to war for purposes of intervening in other people's affairs. You maintain military capacity for the purpose of defending your borders, and maybe a limited form of national interest beyond those borders. But ultimately, your whole idea is like, look, not our problem. As long as you're not invading us, again, we want to trade with everybody. And as long as you're not invading us or harming our citizens when they're abroad, we don't care what you do. It's not our problem. That's more of what you would call a non-interventionist, probably libertarian style foreign policy. And then you have more of an isolationist foreign policy. And a lot of times people will pejoratively describe non-interventionism as isolation, and those two are not the same at all. Isolation is really more of a foreign policy that you would see as like Japan's foreign policy before what they call the Meiji Restoration. Um, it's the idea where it's like literally, we don't want you here. We don't care about your goods. We don't care about your technology. We don't care about. Just leave us alone. Right? Japan was very, very much isolationist for a period of time, and Admiral, or was it Commodore Perry? Admiral Perry, forgive me. Kind of opened up Japan. Before that, you had seen there was some trade with the Dutch, some trade with the
It was
Portuguese at various
heavily
times,
restricted, though.
but heavily restricted. This was literally a culture and a society that was very, very much skeptical of any sort of foreign influences coming in and adjusting the order that they had within that
You had the
society.
same thing in China too, where China was
Yes.
very closed off, and one thing that's worth noting from taking a isolationist or even non-interventionist, but certainly isolationist approaches, sometimes you can close yourself off from useful things that are being discovered in the rest of the world. This is what hurt the Chinese because historically there were a lot of technological innovations that came out of China that kind of propelled it to the top of the tier of civilizations and empires. But because the Chinese adopted a very closed system compared to the rest of the world, and it was, we don't want anything from you except your silver, and you can trade
Yeah.
with us, but we don't want anything from you except your money. Well, what that meant was is that as the Europeans came up with better firearms, better technology, over time the Chinese fell behind because they were closed off from the rest of the world, and they found out the hard way when the Opium Wars broke out that the Chinese had lost their historical military edge that they had over their neighbors, and
Yeah.
it took them. I mean, arguably, they still haven't fully recovered from that. There's a thing called the century of humiliation that China went through from the 1830s or 40s all the way until the 1940s, up until the end of the Chinese Civil War, where China was just constantly invaded, constantly self imploding, falling behind because they were so isolationist for so long.
No, it's really important to understand for anybody that thinks that isolation is a way to actually protect your country and your culture. History has demonstrated that it seldom does so. Now again, there's other ways you can destroy your country as well. Like for instance, constantly getting involved in foreign wars that you shouldn't, right? So or constantly being in the way of great powers who are fighting over territory and buffer states. So there's a number of ways, but the if we had to like broadly categorize, and I feel absolutely certain that certain foreign policy experts or historians can come in here and be like, what about this? What about this? We're talking about broad categories. So we have the whole idea of we're going to utilize military strength and economic power in order to push ideology but not territorial expansion. Then we have the various categories of expansionism. Then you have non-interventionism, which is to say we're not going to get involved except to trade and that's it. And then you have the isolation, which is to say leave us alone, we don't want anything from you, etc. I would say that there's another category here that Christian wanted to bring up initially, and I think it's important to talk about because I think it's actually more in line with what we would probably define as Trump doctrine, and that is the whole concept of realpolitik. And Christian, tell us a little bit about how you would define, kind of like maybe Bismarckian realpolitik.
Realpolitik is essentially looking at foreign policy as a question of what is in the best interests of my country and the people that make up my country. It's not what's in the best interest of an ideology. It's not how do I conquer the world and impose my will on the entire world. It's how do I preserve my country's position within the international framework and advance my country's interests, hopefully through diplomacy, but if necessary, through military force. I mean, Bismarck famously played a pivotal role in basically starting 3 wars. But notice that after he instigated 3 wars against the Danes and then the Austrians and then the French, he spent the rest of his life trying to preserve peace in Europe because he thought that Germany was on top in Europe and that any future wars would destabilize Germany's position within the international order. So he tried to construct an alliance network, a relationship network that kept France isolated, but maintained that balance of power that was favorable to Germany. He was not a ruthless imperialist, right? He was not Genghis Khan. He was not Hitler. He was not even Alexander the Great. He wasn't above or beyond starting a war and conquering territory to improve Prussia's position. But he was not an idealist. He was not an ideologue. He was a German patriot, I would say. And
Well,
there's a speech, Nick, that he gave in I think 1862, where he said something along the lines of, and I'm not quoting him directly, right? I don't have the quote in front of me, but he said something along the lines of, the position of Prussia and Germany will not be determined by its liberalism, but by its power. Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be settled. That was the mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood. And what he meant by that is that Prussia's position within the German framework was not going to be determined by how liberal or progressive it was. It was going to be determined by military force. But the question about German unification and who's going to do it was tried to be settled through, basically liberal means in the 1840s during the revolutions in 1848, and that failed. And Bismarck said, no, this is going to happen through military force. So he started 3 wars to do it, pulled it off, unified Germany. But then again, after that happened, he didn't say, now we're going to invade Russia. And now
yeah.
we're going to, in fact, he actually threatened to throw himself out of a 2-story window when the king of Prussia, Wilhelm I, after the Battle of Königgrätz, where the Prussians crushed the Austrians, the Prussian king was like, now on to Vienna. Now we're going to conquer the Austrian Empire and create a, pan-European empire. And Bismarck was about to, he threatened to resign. He threatened to kill himself because he didn't want that to happen, because he thought that was going to be detrimental to Prussia's position, because it would create a coalition against Prussia, similar to what happened against Napoleon.
So that's really important, because I want to distinguish something here, because what you will notice about US history is that at different points in different history, we've actually applied different policies within the categories that we've discussed. But one of the things that is important to understand about realpolitik is the danger of realpolitik is that you can essentially justify what we might define as immoral action in order to, based off of no more justification than what's in our country's best interest, right? The bank robber has determined that your money is in his best interest if it's his money, right? So that's obviously an immoral application of realpolitik. Let me give you another application that, let's just admit, is morally questionable, but can at least be understood under a larger historical framework. Prussia had, for much of its history, been the crossroads of various invading armies. It's interesting how in our American psyche right now we think we somewhat think poorly. In America, we sometimes think poorly of French military prowess, and a lot of that is due to somewhat World War One, but especially World War Two. But what's important to understand is that all the way up through until you get to Frederick the Great, a lot of times, and certainly during the Napoleonic Wars, a lot of times it was the Prussians that have been kicked all over the map, either by greater powers in Russia. You had the Lithuanian Commonwealth. You had the Swedish under Gustavus Adolphus. You had elements of the Holy Roman Empire, which was powerful to a certain degree, but greatly fractured. And so this idea is that this idea that we sometimes have, that Germany is actually kind of a dangerous threat. Germany actually kind of got kicked around a lot, and a lot of that was due to disunity among the various German tribes, whether it was under the Romans or the Hunnic Empire, which came in and just completely cleaned their clock in many respects. And so it's important to understand that if you're looking at it from the term of Bismarck, he is sitting here looking at it, and you have this massive plain, right? This massive area, which is very, very easy to navigate for armies, going right through, the eastern portion of his country. And so this idea of unifying Germany in order to be able to provide a coherent internal defense, which provided sufficient homeland, sufficient resources, and sufficient area to be able to effectively defend against other great powers, was incredibly important. And so, to some degree, it made sense to engage in elements of conquest in order to provide for that unification. Now, I want you to think about the United States with the whole concept of manifest destiny. Now, I don't think the United States can actually come off with the same moral justifications that you might have within Prussia, because the United States wasn't facing incredible powers that were, all around it that could potentially destroy it. Like, we were blessed with this idea of a massive ocean that people had to cross in order to invade the United States. But there was this idea that for the United States to be able to exist, especially in an era where European powers were constantly meddling in places around the world, that the United States had to be able to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and control an area which was defensible, sufficient for resources, sufficient for expansion, and would allow for the air to be able to compete with any sort of outside power, primarily European powers, that would want to potentially, take it. Um, this weighed very heavily on the American mind. This is why you also see the Monroe Doctrine, which was to say that the United States took a position, and the United States actually took a position very early on within its history that it was arguably not in a position to be able to effectively defend, but it was the idea that it would not accept European intervention and meddling into the Western Hemisphere, that the United States was essentially going to be the dominant power within that space and did not want to permit other European nations from um, establishing a strong enough foothold in order to threaten the dominance of the United States. So that's where you can actually see elements of this combination of expansionist policy and realpolitik. Now, when you get into things like the Spanish American War or the Mexican American War, you can definitely see areas where the United States participated in the instigation of conflicts, either against European powers, which Spain with the Spanish American War, or the Mexican American War, where it's, there's various expansionistic goals. Um, where the US is taking and shoring up particular territory, but it's not actually taking the territory in the way that you would see a typical expansionist country. There was actually there was this idea within American culture that was very much anti-imperialist. So even though the United States did control the Philippines for a significant period of time following the Spanish American War all the way up until, post World War II, even though you saw the United States, conquering a significant, I mean, the United States military we had taken Mexico City, we had taken Chapultepec, we had taken Mexico, we had taken Cuba, and yet the United States engaged in a policy where in many of these areas that we could have theoretically conquered, colonized, or kept as territories, they were given back.
Huge mistake.
but
Huge
but the
mistake.
but the idea is that it's important to understand that in an American mindset, there was this idea dating all the way back from Washington that there was an area that we wanted to control that we thought was, again, part of that manifest destiny or important to us, but also skeptical of empire and foreign entanglements. And a lot of that kind of got railroaded during the Wilsonian era, and especially post World War II, where the United States was now, for a brief period of time, the sole world's nuclear power and the overall dominant economic and military power. Then you had the Cold War, and then after the Cold War, I think it's special. I don't think it's sufficient to just say post World War II. I think it's post Cold War, where you had the United States as the lone global kind of hegemon. And if we had wanted to engage in just rampant imperialism, we could have, and we didn't. And to this day, there is no other power in the world that is capable of competing with the United States economically or militarily. And yes, that includes China. And that's going to become very evident over the next 30 years. Over the next 30 years, I think you're going to see such a diminished, diminished economic and military power within China that it's actually probably, I still maintain that I could see conflict between China and Russia for a variety of reasons, but that's a conversation for a different day. So here's what I want to do right now. Now that we've kind of talked about these various concepts and approaches to military power, repolitik, expansionism, isolationism, non-interventionism, the United States has clearly been engaging in a kind of a make the world safe for democracy ever since World War One on various levels. Where the libertarians would like to take us is into more of a non-interventionist trade with everybody, war with nobody. You solve your own problems, and there's a healthy degree of respect for that kind of what we might call baseline approach, like our starting approach. And this actually goes back to Washington, right? We're happy to trade with everybody. Keep your problems to yourself. It's not our problems. Where I see Trump falling into this is something of I'm going to say that if I had to establish Trump doctrine, I think it falls into more of a realpolitik component, to where for the first time in a while, the United States would be willing to more aggressively use economic and military power, not for the purpose of making the world safe for democracy, but for securing strategic terrain and agreements which Trump believes are vital to our long-term strategic interests. And so I don't think he's beyond using the military, but I don't think he's an expansionist in the sense that he wants to like expand American territory for the sake of expanding American territory. And I certainly think he's willing to be far more aggressive with America's economic strength in order to negotiate deals which he believes is better for the US economically. So I think it's a combination of realpolitik, with not conquest ethic, but not afraid to use the military to expand US territory, where he thinks it is a vital concern to US interests. And that's something that I don't think we've actually been willing to do for quite some time. Christian, do you agree, disagree, think I'm wrong, right?
No, I think that well, and I've brought this up a couple times on previous podcasts. We are stuck in this old form of thinking that is a post-war and also especially post-Cold War mindset, which is neoconservatism versus non-interventionism or isolationism. That's incorrect. I don't think that that's what the debate is. I think that the debate is increasingly Realpolitik versus Weltpolitik. And this is the type of debate that the German Empire had in the lead up to the creation of the German Empire, but especially after the creation of the German Empire. In the early 20th century, the German Empire was the most powerful nation in the entire world. They had the most powerful economy. They certainly had the most powerful armed forces. They had just defeated the Austrians and the French back to back within just a few years of each other, who were the other two great powers in the European continent. There was no question that they were the strongest nation in Europe and thus, by default, kind of the most strongest nation in the world. The United States was catching up, but certainly militarily, we were far behind. And the debate of foreign policy within the German government in the late 19th, early 20th century was the Bismarckian view, the Realpolitik view, versus the view of a lot of members of the German military and eventually the German emperor himself, Wilhelm II, which was Weltpolitik. And Weltpolitik was the expansionist view. It wasn't a genocidal view, although you could certainly point to there were instances like in some of the German colonies in Africa where there were atrocities perpetuated against native inhabitants, like in Namibia. But by and large, it was not a Genghis Khan style foreign policy, right? You know, you surrender or we're going to burn everything to the ground and kill all of you. It was imperialist, similar to the British. But it was very imperialist. It was very aggressive. It was Germany, deserves its place in the sun. Germany deserves to be at the epicenter of Europe, and we're going to force our will on our neighbors. We're going to integrate Austria in economically. We're going to probably fight a second war against the French and crush them. We're going to conquer large parts of Eastern Europe from the Russians, and we're going to create
definitely aggressive.
Yeah, Mittel Europa, which was the dream of all these guys.
Yeah.
Bismarck was against that very much so, because he thought, again, if you just throw your weight around like this, like nobody else matters, you're going to create a coalition against you, similar to what Napoleon dealt with. And so it wasn't that he was squeamish or cowardly on the foreign policy stage. He was very pro German interests, but he was not an imperialist.
Well, another
And
way to think of realpolitik is basically elevating practicality above ideology.
yes.
And now I will say this: there's a danger in that as well. There's a way that practicality can become its own ideology, which is to say that if you believe it becomes practical, therefore it's justified. And so there has to be, I still believe there has to be some sort of guiding philosophy
You have to
to
have some
your
guardrails. Yeah.
yes. There's supposed to be moral guardrails to what you're doing. You can't just say, well, gosh, I think it's in our practical best interest to do whatever we want, right? Like there's supposed to be guardrails, and Bismarck's guardrails was he wanted to secure what he perceived to be, and what historically you could certainly point to as kind of the traditional Germanic, um, Prussian homeland, tribal areas, etc., in a way that was defensible. Because again, you have to look at one of the benefits of the United States that sometimes I don't think we fully appreciate when we look at other countries is we have these two massive, glorious oceans, which make it incredibly difficult for any other power to be able to interfere like we do. Even in the height of World War I and World War II, we weren't fighting in Chicago, right? We weren't dealing with existential threats the same way that the UK, France, and other countries were. And a lot of that is the benefit of our geography and the benefit of our not just our global dominance, but our absolute utter dominance within our hemisphere. And that's significant.
And that explains part of why I think that we should have Cuba. Cuba should be ours. I think pretty
We're
much
gonna get to that.
everything in
Tina's
the
going
Gulf.
full Weltpolitik here.
We
Cuba should
weren't.
be ours.
No, I'm not. This it makes sense strategically not to have a foreign nation less than 100 miles off your coast.
Well, okay, well, Mexico and Canada are right on our border.
Well, that brings me to my next point. I think I go back to, and I said this in an earlier podcast, and I said what I said, and I'm standing by it. And that is, we should annex everything from the Panama Canal all the way up north.
Tina
And
is
we'll go
not.
ahead and
Okay. Well, in
Tina,
Tina's
you are not
attempt to jump us
defeating.
ahead to the very end of the podcast where we engage in wild speculation. The first thing that we have to address is what Trump has already said. So now we've kind of established like this concept of
it's the Gulf of America.
Tina is not defeating the allegations that women start more wars than men.
oh yeah, no, it's no. Tina wants to be governor general of Greenland for Trump. But like, all right, so here's what we're gonna do. Now that we've kind of established like what are the different ways, what are the historical precedents, and how do we think Trump's foreign policy, or what, again, let's just call it the Trump doctrine, differs from other doctrines that have kind of guided US policy in recent history. Let's look at the Trump doctrine, and let's look at like the question of Greenland or the question of the Panama Canal, and let's kind of imagine what would be like a soft application of the Trump doctrine versus a hard application of the Trump doctrine. And let's start with Greenland. So Trump has already said that he wants Greenland. He thinks it should be a part of. He perceives it as being certainly more in the American orbit than it is the European orbit, and that obviously makes sense from a geographical perspective. He thinks that there's an obvious strategic necessity there, especially as you look at Arctic lines of communication and trade routes and things like that through the ocean. He questions, and this is always interesting whenever you start to see people throw out these terms, because Greenland has for the last several decades um, been ostensibly a part of Denmark. Now, keep in mind, Greenland has about 56,000 people there. So, to give you an idea, as a member of the state legislature in the lower house of Virginia, I represent more people than the entire population of Greenland. All right, so there's a very, very small population, but a fairly sizable land mass. There's obviously mineral wealth, and there's strategic necessity because when you own territory, you don't just own territory, you own a certain portion of the ocean within that territory. And that's where it becomes very, very important for shipping lanes, lines of communication, et cetera. So what seems to be evident here is that there seems to be a number of people within Greenland that also don't want to be uh, subject to Denmark, and at least on some degree, I don't know to what extent, would rather be associated with the United States or politically aligned with the United States rather than Denmark. So here's the question. This is what we're going to throw out here. And I want, obviously Christian to talk about it. I want, Generalissimo, Queen of the Bees to talk about it. Like, what do we think is let's say the soft application of Trump doctrine to Greenland?
The soft application is pretty simple. You basically bribe the people of Greenland to vote for independence from Denmark and join the United States, not probably as a state, but potentially as a commonwealth, similar to there's some Pacific Island areas that are
America
kind of like,
Samoa,
yeah,
or
like in a free association with the US where they largely govern themselves, right? It's very rare that you get like an act of Congress that intervenes in their stuff, but we handle foreign policy, we handle defense. And in the case of Greenland, if Greenland was a part of the United States, not even as a state or territory, but as like a commonwealth similar to like Puerto Rico, that would open up American investment dollars. And
yeah.
so this is actually an issue that I've seen some people bring up, which is, oh, well, why doesn't Elon Musk and Donald Trump get together and just offer $1 million or $500,000 to every person in Greenland to basically bribe them into voting for independence and joining the US? Well, that would explode inflation in Greenland. If every Greenlander became a millionaire, then $1 million wouldn't really get you that far in Greenland because you wouldn't see a multitude increase in the GDP of the country. So suddenly your
Well,
McDonald's
they leave
hamburger,
Greenland.
yeah. Well, they would have to because their money would
Yeah.
become worthless. And so the promise that we should be making the people of Greenland is not just, yeah, we'll bribe you to vote for independence. I'm actually, believe it or not, willing to entertain that because it would relatively be quite cheap.
Yeah.
But what we need to be promising them is investment money to build infrastructure, to tap into all the energy resources that Greenland has, the natural resources that Greenland has, to grow the economy, to increase the amount of stuff that money can buy in Greenland, supply side economics, basically. And we can do it. We have the largest market in the world. There's
So,
so many.
but okay. So to say that the soft application that you think is that essentially we uh, we enter into negotiations with the population of Greenland where we offer them the various economic benefits of being a political entity within the United States, not a state, but a territory or some other sort of economic arrangement, or some other political arrangement. And the idea is that we place pressure for Denmark to allow for a referendum within Greenland to separate.
So Greenland can technically, the Danes themselves kind of did this to themselves. Greenland can technically declare independence whenever it wants. It doesn't
Well,
do
what's interesting
so.
is Denmark, and it was so funny to hear Macron, the French president, say, you know, Greenland will not be a part of, we don't want the United States interfering in European affairs. Yeah, until the Germans or the Russians come knocking, and then all of a sudden you desperately want us involved in European affairs. But that's a different episode. Um,
And the French
the
are also
day,
in
the
no
day,
place
the,
to stop an American
yeah.
acquisition of Greenland.
Well, and this is the problem with this overemphasis on soft power. You have this European obsession with soft power, as if we're going to win you over with how debonair and sophisticated we are. Like, I got news for you. Bismarck was right. You can give flowery speeches, you can have great art, you can have wonderful food, but at the end of the day, political power does come through the ability to project force. And if you have the ability to project force, you can engage in soft power. If you don't, well, then I'm sorry, take your cultural exchange and shove it, because you can't ultimately impose your will, and so you can't do it. And Macron doesn't seem to understand that. So, but Denmark also said, well, Greenland might be independent, but it will never be with the United States. Well, okay, well, which is it? Can they be independent and therefore engage in self determination? And not to mention the fact that what exactly are you going to do about it, Denmark? If Greenland decided we want to be independent from Denmark, and oh, by the way, we would also like to be a territory of the United States because we see the massive economic advantage from that sort of association, what is Denmark going to do? Like nothing is the answer. That's what they're going to do. Issue a sharp note of protest. Like that's it. So I agree with Christian that the soft route here is strong encouragement and economic enticement of the population of Greenland to essentially declare independence and then issue another referendum in order to enter into some sort of political arrangement that would put them, and when we look at kind of the wide, historic, like what are the various associations that a people can have with another power. They can be fully integrated. That's where you see like a state. They can be partially integrated. That's something like a territory. And then you have other categories. You have things like vassal states. Vassal states were ones that were generally afforded some opportunity to be able to engage in self governance, but they were still subject to far more interference in their day-to-day operations than like a protectorate. A protectorate is generally a political arrangement that is somewhat similar to a vassal, but a protector generally has a high degree of autonomy when it comes to day-to-day operations of the overall internal running of the country, but they're still expected to engage in economic transactions as well as provide some degree of military support if called upon to protect the dominant power. So typically, I think what you would see with something like Greenland is the referendum, the separation, the territory. What would you say is a hard application of the Trump doctrine toward Greenland?
Hard application is, well, we already have a military there. And
Well,
so we
that's
say
not Trump, though. He is not about military force. He's made that really clear. I mean,
he actually didn't.
No, he didn't.
Trump literally
no, I mean, in his first term, he made it really clear that we're not sending boots on the ground for willy nilly and endangering people's lives for.
No, that's you're talking about dealing with threats overseas, not
This is not
something like
Syria.
Greenland.
This is not Iraq.
Yeah.
People need to understand, we already have boots on the ground in Greenland. We have military bases in Greenland. There are American soldiers stationed in Greenland as we are speaking right now. There is no Danish military in Greenland. Greenland is already under American. Go
Let me
ahead.
give a scenario. Let me give a scenario where I could see a hard application of the Trump doctrine. Let's say Denmark changes its mind and says, no, Greenland is not allowed to have a referendum. I can see Trump at that point saying, you are now going back on your word and not permitting for the self-determination of the people of Greenland, and essentially actively going in there and saying, no, Greenland can have a referendum. And then when they have the referendum, Denmark is essentially forced to either say, we're going to intervene, which they can't, or they can say, well, fine, we don't acknowledge it, which we don't care. Right? That's what they could do. But the hard application would be Trump. The hard application, I think, would be Denmark intervening to say Greenland cannot have that kind of referendum to separate, or more likely putting some sort of restrictions on it that would make it impossible for Greenland to come to any other conclusion other than remaining part of Denmark, and the United States flexing economic and military power to essentially say, nope, Greenland can do it. What I don't see now, if Greenland did have a referendum and they chose to remain with Denmark, I don't know what the hard application of the Trump doctrine would be in that place, because I think he sees Greenland as a long-term strategic necessity. I don't think he would then engage in like military conquest of Greenland. I think what he would do is actively up the ante with respect to the economic incentives to change Greenlanders' minds
Yeah, you can
on
engage in
with it.
massive tariffs against Denmark and Denmark alone. And I mean,
I
because
mean, the problem is that Denmark only exports 10% of what they export to the U.S.
yeah,
That's
but
not very much.
the Danes own some of the largest merchant marines of any country in the world. There are Danish ships that carry non-Danish goods to American ports. And if Trump says, all of
Yeah,
these shipping
any
lines
Danish flagged ship isn't welcome.
are not welcome, in addition to tariffs and other economic, basically sanctions against the Danish state, there is a way for the United States to use hard force that's not, guns,
Yeah.
right? There are ways for the United States to pry Greenland from Denmark that doesn't require a military invasion. My point,
Is
though,
Greenland
about
that important to us, though?
I think Greenland is quite important. Greenland is so important to us that it goes all the way back to the 1860s when you had American secretaries of state that were suggesting that we try to buy Greenland. We've been trying to buy it from Denmark for over 160 years. They have told us no 3 times. And I
Yeah.
think Trump is the one person who's like, he's not going to take no as an answer.
I think we could even well, not only that, but because there seems to be at least some motivation within the population of Greenland to particularly separate, Denmark might have screwed themselves over here because they probably could have gotten a total sweetheart deal. Because if there's one thing the American government is good at, it's overpaying. Like for things. Denmark probably could have got a really, really good deal if they would just go along with this. But I think that they're engaging in a kind of, I don't know, I don't want to call it a misguided pride, but that probably is a fair
Well,
explanation of
if
it.
Denmark can,
Um,
or sorry, if Greenland can just declare itself independent, we don't even need to negotiate with them. With Denmark, we could negotiate with Greenland and say, declare yourself independent and then join in with us.
yeah.
And they're the ones we'll need to negotiate with then.
Yeah. All right. So we've gone over soft application, hard application of Trump doctrine. What do we say the probability is that Greenland becomes a territory or some other political arrangement with the United States within 4 years of the Trump administration? You got to give a percentage probability that you think it will happen. Tina, what percentage?
What percentage do I think will get Greenland? Or
What no? What percentage? What do you think
The odds
what do you
are.
think the probability, the odds are that Greenland actually becomes we'll just say a territory because that's just an easy way. A
okay,
territory of the United States within the next 4 years.
70%.
Christian,
I was going to say like 25 to 30%.
I actually think I'm going to go with Tina. I think it's 70.
You
I
think
think
that
we
we're
get
going to
Greenland.
grow the US? See, here's the thing. I think that Greenland could very well declare independence in the next 4 years. I think it would take a much longer time for Greenland to sort out an agreement with the United States because there might be an element within Greenland's politics that wants like a seat in the UN as an independent nation, and then at that point, it's like, well, then you're not part of the United States, and so
So I think that's interesting, and I would take that into consideration, but I don't think it fundamentally alters the percentage.
I think
I actually think
independence
I'm
from
going to go
Denmark.
70% chance. I'm going to go 70% chance Greenland enters into some sort of um, political arrangement with the United States where it would become um, a part of U.S.
Yeah, I don't think that they
territory.
will go fully independent because
No,
that leaves
I don't
them
think
with
there's any advantage to them for
that
that.
leaves them without protection, and they're not. I mean,
They're tiny. They're
they're
smaller than
so
Culpeper
small.
County.
Yeah.
They absolutely have to have protection. And we
Yeah, but I mean, like Denmark itself is under U.S. protection. That doesn't mean that
Yeah.
Denmark is part of the United States. Like you have this. This is a
Well,
whole
no,
look,
I
look,
other.
look, look,
understand,
we got to
but
move on. We're not going to
Greenland
debate
can
this.
depend on
Tina
Denmark
says
to
70.
defend
I
them.
say
So
70.
The
Wait,
last thing the last thing I'll say on this is I would give it probably like 70% odds that Greenland breaks free from Denmark. I don't know if that means that we're going to get to a point where Greenland becomes part of the United States.
that's fair. That's fair.
fair enough. Fair enough. Squish. All right. Next, we're going to talk about the Panama Canal. Panama Canal, soft application of Trump doctrine versus hard application of Trump doctrine. So, soft application of Trump doctrine on the Panama Canal. Christian, I'm going to start with you this time.
Soft application is Trump negotiates a treaty with the Panamanians that bar foreign nations, particularly the Chinese, from having any sort of stake or operation in the functioning of the Panama Canal, in part because the treaty that Carter foolishly signed with the Panamanians actually allowed the United States to take possession of the canal again if Panama was found to be basically incapable of running it themselves, or if a foreign power came in and tried to take possession of it. And so I think that Trump could potentially invoke some of the clauses within that treaty and basically say we are concerned about Chinese influence with the canal's operation, and we want to renegotiate a treaty with the Panamanians to ensure that nobody has any sort of say on how this thing functions except for you guys and us if we decide to intervene. I think that's a soft approach to the Panama Canal issue. And if the Panamanians resist, again, that's where you get tariffs. That's where you get things like, for example, Panama
Economic.
has one of the largest merchant marines in the world,
Yeah.
just like Denmark. In fact, even larger. It's like every ship.
Let me just stop you right there. So everyone understands, right? When it comes to merchant marines and when it comes to things like that, there are a lot of countries that will build ships that trade in international waters and the whole deal, but they get flagged under a different country. To give you an idea, some of the laws in the United States are so stupid that Mongolia, a landlocked country in Asia, has technically, I think, a larger flagged merchant fleet than the United States does on the high seas. And if you want to study more about that, you can go to the Y minutes where we actually talk about it. It's so like, don't even get me started on the Jones Act. But the point is that that's there. And so what Christian is pointing out is that that provides an economic benefit to Panama that the United States could potentially leverage against them if we wanted to engage in kind of like economic incentives or disincentives. So that's okay, Tina. Soft application of the Trump doctrine toward Panama. What do you see him doing?
I think that uh I think he wants it back. And so I think that the soft version is not going to stop short of getting it back. Uh and so I would say he's probably going to go with, tariffs and things of that nature. He may try to even buy it back from them or something. I mean, he's talking about buying Greenland. So you know, he's a great negotiator. I can't wait to see what he does, but I think there isn't a scenario where he lets them keep the canal.
All right, so you think soft scenarios he provides some sort of economic incentive or threat, but the Panama Canal comes back under U.S. control.
Yes, and I really hesitate to say I think he might be harder on that than he would be on the Greenland.
So I would say that the soft application of Trump power in there, I think I mean, I tend to agree with Christian that I could see a scenario where he essentially he bars certain nations from being able to in any way manage the Panama Canal, and to that degree, it's the and part of it is because there's a legal mechanism. There's at least a legal pathway to be able to do that based off of the treaty that was signed, which is to say
Right,
that
and
we're
they have been having problems. Now, of course, they're
yeah,
blaming
yeah,
climate change, right?
yeah,
Oh, El
yeah,
Nino and all of this, but
yeah.
they have had problems with the maintenance and operations, and so um, there is an established pathway to get it back totally legally and just say this is ours now again.
So
You
the,
guys
the big
botched it.
the big difference here is the Christian and I see the soft application of the Trump doctrine as one where there could be a negotiated settlement for either Panamanian control with American oversight or joint control between the two, but the exclusion of certain entities or maybe other foreign entities. You're saying you see even the soft application of Trump doctrine is the United States will be the one running the Panama Canal.
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. Hard
At least, I
application.
mean,
Oh, sorry.
at least we're the ones with the full oversight of it. I mean, I'm sure Panamanians would still work it, but they wouldn't own
Yeah.
it.
Sure. Okay, I'm gonna start with the hard application of the Trump doctrine. I actually agree with Tina that on this one, I could actually see, and again, when we talked about the hard application, we're kind of talking about worst case scenario. Um, because obviously there's a multitude of multitude of things from, hey, here's some economic incentives to we've just invaded and taken over your country, right? But I'm going to go with to make this interesting. The hard scenario I think is I could see Trump starting off with the soft one. Hey, the Chinese no longer get to run the Panama Canal. In fact, it's either you guys running it with our oversight, or we're running it. Panama kind of pushing back on that, and this is one where I could see Trump using military power. I think Trump sees the Panama Canal as such a strategic necessity. I think he has a legal. I think he causes belli, right? Like I don't think he's going to try to take over Panama. I don't think he's going to try to overthrow the government necessarily. But I could see Trump saying, "No, you don't understand. This is going to happen. I am willing to use military force in order to make it happen. You can either get on board with the economic incentives, or we will come down and take it." And again, without having to invade, your government will essentially be toppled. Because just because we're not the ones that are going to invade doesn't mean we can't significantly help your political opposition if it means we could potentially get a governing authority within Panama that would welcome the United States back in as the owner and manager of the Panama Canal, but with significant economic benefit to the Panamanian people. And like you said, Tina, it's not like Panamanians wouldn't be working on the Panama Canal. It would just mean that the United States essentially had the legal authority to determine who was responsible for securing it and running it. And so I think the hard application would be if you had a very, very stubborn Panamanian government that said, nope, we're not willing to concede on this. I could see the threat of military force combined with the support of whatever regime would essentially sign off on that sort of deal, getting sufficient American backing in order to be successful within a political election. I don't think he invades, topples the government, and now takes it over in this scenario. But I do think he intervenes he intervenes with enough military and economic power in order to ensure American control of the Panama Canal. And at that point, you'd have a treaty completely rewritten with a new government that would essentially cede control to the Panama Canal. That's what I believe would be hard application of the Trump doctrine. Tina.
Yeah. Are we going to the hard application now? I would agree with what you said.
Okay.
Yeah,
Christian,
I
you
think
got
the
any?
military force is warranted in that situation.
So, I mean, a hard application is you take possession. Panama doesn't have the military ability to stop the
What?
United States. But
Okay, so when we
I
say
don't
hard application, we're not saying what Trump could do. We're saying what do we think is actually likely within the confines of the Trump doctrine that we've attempted to articulate.
Sure. Well, in that context, then what I think is most likely to happen, you can say this is hard or soft. It depends on your interpretation. But what I think is most likely to happen is the United States leverages enormous economic incentives to pressure the Panamanians into handing control back to the United States.
But
And
how's that different from the soft application?
because it's handing it back to the United States, not
Got it.
renegotiating the treaty.
Got
And
it.
so again, like you can say Panamanian ships aren't welcome in the US anymore. You can say Panama now has a 30% tariff or a 200% tariff. Doesn't matter what the percentage is. You just cripple the Panamanian economy. And Panama's not part of NATO. It's not a first world nation. It does rely heavily on the United States. It doesn't really have a military. Like, I mean, we've invaded Panama previously under Noriega in the late 80s. And it took like what, a day or two for us to basically take him out and take possession. And
Pretty quick.
yeah, I'm not saying that we're gonna, Noriega the current government, but
Yeah.
I mean, I will say this though, this actually gets into a broader concern that I have, that I was trying to articulate earlier about Realpolitik versus Weltpolitik, because it's easy for us to we could take over the whole of Panama if we wanted to. I mean, we almost did when we created Panama. Panama used to be part of Colombia, and
Yeah.
the Colombians didn't
Teddy
want.
Roosevelt is
Yeah,
Yeah.
we literally pried Panama away from Colombia, created a new country, and then signed a treaty with that new country to construct the canal in the first place. This was over a century ago, and so it's easy for us to basically say, well, we could do whatever we want to take possession of the Panamanian Canal. That's not the question. The question is, what happens when you do that to another country and another country and another country? This is what Germany before World War I found themselves in a
okay,
position.
but let's not jump into the last
No.
segment.
Because there's certain things where we already had. It was there's things that were basically ours that we could be taking back. That's different than taking ground we never had before.
Well, look. Here's the bottom line. We're gonna get to the whole what happens if America
okay.
says screw it, let's just do this thing.
So then to
I
answer
want to
the
know.
question,
I want to know what is the ice like? Just focusing on this. What's the hard application of Trump doctrine? To
a
the
hard application is whatever it takes in order to take possession of the canal. You can start soft with just economic sanctions and tariffs, and you can escalate as much as Trump really wants to go. He kind of has the ability to interpret the treaty however
Okay,
he
but
wants.
you're cheating, Christian. You're cheating.
I
We
am,
know
but
he
I
can
think
do all
that's-
that.
I
We're
think
saying,
that's
what
what's
does he
gonna
do? What is the most reasonable application of the hard? What is the most reasonable hard application of the Trump doctrine?
I
in
think
this
he
case?
engages in a trade war with the Panamanians in order to cripple their economy to the point that they must come to the negotiating table. Is what
Okay.
and I think that will happen. I don't know
Yeah.
what the final treaty will look like, but I do think there will be a revision of the Carter era treaty. I just don't know exactly what it'll entail.
Okay, so now let's go to probability. What is the probability that we have a renegotiation of the current agreement with Panama that puts? I'm going to go a step further. That puts the United States in an overwhelmingly dominant position with respect to the management canal. What is the probability that that happens within the next 4 years, Christian?
40 to 50%.
40, 50%, Tina.
I'm gonna go with 70 again.
I think it's 70. I think it's 70. I don't. I think. Yeah.
Man,
I think.
honey, you and I we really see eye to eye. I'm so glad that you agree with everything I say.
I'm just being so cautious here. I like keep saying, you know why? Because Nick, I'm stuck in the nothing ever happens mindset.
Yeah.
And this whole episode is talking about things happening.
Yeah, yeah.
And so
yeah.
I'm just so hesitant to
Well,
like,
and speaking of that, we got one other thing that we're gonna do very quick, and then we're gonna get to the wild speculation that we're all really
Oh my
excited
gosh,
about,
can we
right?
wildly speculate already? Come on.
No, here he goes. We got one more thing that we got to do. Soft and hard application, drug cartels in Mexico. All right, so
oh, can I go first?
yeah, go ahead and go
Okay.
first.
Um, soft
Soft
app-
application first.
Soft application is you rip up the free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, but particularly with Mexico, and you implement massive tariffs on
To
Mexico.
deal with the cartels?
Yes, you plunge them into a depression because they have a socialist as I don't care at all what happens to Mexico. The Mexican government currently is an enemy of the United States. They have a woke socialist leftist running their country who was more concerned about pride parade marches in Mexico at a time when 34 members who were campaigning for the Mexican legislative chamber were assassinated by cartels during their last election cycle. And they're pumping drugs and money and facilitating human trafficking into my country. And the Mexican government has the ability to do stuff to put an end to this, and they are willingly choosing not to do so because they want to negotiate with these people rather than eradicate them. So we should be treating them basically like a rogue state and telling them, no, you actually don't do any trade with the United
This
States.
is your
until
soft. This is your soft.
Yes.
The soft approach.
This is
okay.
this is the
So your soft approach
the,
is just tearing up NAFTA and plunging the Mexican economy into like real problems.
real problems because they do a lot of trade with us. And you
So
say
then, okay.
Trump's already threatening exactly what
and you
Christian's saying.
say until you do your work to secure your northern border with the United States and you stop the flow of drugs and money and particularly migrants into our country and you stop facilitating the cartels, we're not going to do business with you. Hard
Okay.
approach is you engage in drone strikes on Mexican soil against cartel members. You
Okay,
do to
Tina-
Mexico what we were previously doing in the Middle East for no reason. We
Yeah.
actually do that against real enemies of the United States that are operating on Mexican soil. And what are the Mexican government going to do? Write a strong note of protest?
Yeah.
Like they have no ability to actually prevent us from taking action that we need to take to protect our country.
Okay, I'm gonna go.
I'm
I'll
gonna
go
agree with
next.
Christian.
I'll
I
go-
have nothing to add.
Okay, I'll go next. I think the soft application. I actually think the soft application in this case is also going to include military force. The
You
soft
think
application is
soft?
going to
Well,
what's that?
soft application military?
Soft.
Oh wow.
I think the soft application will also include. I think it'll include the economic component. I can definitely see significant portions of NAFTA being thrown out. I can definitely see like a very, very kind of hostile economic. But here's the other thing that needs to be considered with all this, right? We can talk all day long about like NAFTA and the problems with Mexico. Trump also does not want to drastically increase the cost of basic goods and services that Americans, are going to the grocery store. So a lot of this stuff we can be very, very cavalier about. Oh, the United States can do X, Y. Look, whether we like it or not, we are currently we have dug ourselves an economic hole that doesn't get immediately fixed by simply engaging in economic wars with a lot of our major trading partners. And Mexico is a major trading partner with the United States, and so that would have an impact on day-to-day goods and services that Americans want. And so I actually think that while he will play in hardball with Mexico economically, I think he's also aware that he doesn't want, again, he doesn't want grocery prices and everything else exponentially increasing um, within the first year of his presidency. That's why I actually think the soft application of power comes with economic renegotiation combined with, we'll say, a first attempt at law enforcement and military cooperation with the Mexican government in order to deal with the cartels. Whether or not the Mexican government will accept that remains to be seen. But I think that's his first approach is, look, we have the power. It will hurt us, but it'll hurt you more. So engage in the economic renegotiation, help deal with the border security component. We will provide law enforcement and military assistance to that end, and we will help ensure a certain degree of security for Mexican politicians and officials that are willing to fight the cartels. So it won't be just you figure it out on your own because, quite frankly, I don't think the Mexican government has the capacity to do it right now. I just don't. Not against the cartels. Now the libertarians will say, "Well, just legalize drugs," but we're not even talking about that. Different episode. So I think he actually starts off the soft approach has an economic component with a law enforcement and military component. His hard approach is his hard approach with Mexico is now you're talking about, to Christian's point, active drone strikes. I could actually see active military engagement in the north of Mexico against the cartels. I see him directly targeting cartel leaders. The problem is there's so much money to be made that you're always going to have somebody jumping into that position. But he could make it so incredibly hostile. The question then is, what is the Mexican government's response to all of this? And that's the reason why I think you could actually see more military engagement down into those areas. Because if he can actually secure some of those areas in such a way to where he greatly diminishes, he secures our own border, greatly diminishes cartels' ability to operate. Um, the Mexican government is put in a fairly untenable position to where they're not able to effectively respond militarily. And so, to Christian's point, they can make the sharp notes of protest, but if he's actually diminishing cartel capabilities, securing the border, while at the same time creating a more secure environment around that border, I think you actually run the risk. I think what would end up happening is he facilitates the collapse of, and by collapse, I don't mean the entire government collapses. I think he just creates conditions to where the economic incentives and the security incentives for the opposition party is enough to help them win control of the government, and then you re-sign trade agreements, security agreements, border agreements, which are highly favorable to U.S. strategic objectives, which they essentially have to concede as a result. So that's what I think are both the soft and
Yeah,
hard
we've gone to
application.
war in the Middle East for less than what Mexico has done.
Well, the other thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to the United States foreign sources of energy for the United States, Canada and Mexico are far more important to the U.S. than the Middle East is. And with respect to Mexico, it's generally the northern portion of the country. So it's the same areas that you could actually see greater U.S. military involvement in order to deal with cartels.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me that we have been so willing to go to war, in Iraq and Afghanistan and all of these places. Um, and we have not dealt with Mexico. And it's really interesting because I understand that Mexico's not sending military over our border or whatever, but um, you know, so like Afghanistan had terrorist organizations that targeted us, correct? Um, we're getting targeted by cartel organizations in Mexico. And there's a lot of different, it's obviously not the same application,
Yeah.
but I mean, you've got human trafficking like crazy, you've got drugs, and if we could figure out exactly how many people have been killed by their product coming across, I mean, it really could be categorized as an attack.
Well,
Um and so I do wonder, like, why haven't we done this yet?
Well, let me ask this question. What do you guys all think? And I'll go first this time. The probability that Trump uses military force in order to secure the border and significantly degrade cartel operations. I think that's like 90%. 90% he uses the military to secure the border and uses the military along with economic incentives as well, incentives and threats. I think he uses the military to severely degrade cartels. I put it at 90%.
Um, I would put it at about 90% too. I'm not sure if that means that we're going to get like drone strikes in Mexico, but I certainly think that Trump is willing to.
I'll take it a step further. He starts assassinating people within the cartels.
Well,
90%.
I would certainly hope that he does that. That's how you that's how you put an end to this. Basically, you make that the most dangerous job in Central America is to be the head of a drug cartel, right? It's not like we're gonna go after the guys picking the coca in
Yeah.
Colombia. We're gonna kill you specifically,
Okay,
right?
so
Like
if Mexico, okay, just throwing this out here because this is the first time I've really considered that we could get boots on the ground in Mexico. I thought, oh, I don't know what he's
Well,
gonna
and
do.
can we distinguish
But
something?
No,
hold
I
on,
don't
I say
think.
I want to finish. I want to finish.
okay.
Um, so it's this is an interesting thing because if we got Mexico to partner with us to clean up their cartel, like you
Uh-huh.
clearly have this problem with the cartel, let us help you. Give us basically a blank check to go and deal with these cartels. And the way that you're going to partner with us is that you're going to feed us the information that you have on these cartels and who they're linked to and all of that. I foresee there being a strong opportunity for also offering names of political enemies within the country as well. I would think certain factions would start naming people to go after who they were just political enemies and not necessarily cartel.
There's no question, but can we establish something real quick? I don't think we need a great deal of intelligence cooperation from the Mexican government to understand who's who within the cartel structure.
All right. Mexico has a
Well,
horribly corrupt system, so I'm sure a lot of them actually are embedded in
and
the
when I say
government.
boots on the ground, I don't mean the 82nd Airborne Division is jumping into Chihuahua, right? Like I mean
Strikes.
special operations. I mean special
Okay, so here's the
operations.
other question you have then is um sure Trump might do all of this,
Mhm.
but does the rest of does Congress have the stomach for this? Do the American people have the stomach for it? And are they going to let it happen?
If
Like
with
he's
the fentanyl
always
crisis in the
dealing
United
with this
States,
court of public opinion problem. And is he now in his second term going, I can't run for reelection anyway, so I'm just going to cover as much ground as possible.
using I would tell you right now, with the fentanyl crisis in the United States, using Dev Group, CAG, special forces to and really drones. Like we're talking about very, very limited strikes. We're not talking about sending 19-year-olds into Mexico with M4s or the new XM7 or whatever to conduct operations. We're talking about highly specialized units in coordination with DEA and others in order to do these strikes. And I know I'm making every libertarian friend I know furious right now talking about doing this, but I'm speculating what because I do not believe Donald Trump is going to legalize drugs. I think he would be I think he'd be more than willing to use special operations, drone strikes, and strategic targets to assassinate cartel leaders. I don't put that beyond him at all.
I
I think it would be done in the way of more like covert operations. I don't think I don't think it's Third Infantry Division going down and conquering northern Mexico. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's more. Yeah.
I
Anyways,
mean, we could like park some of our big massive ships in the Gulf of America right there next to them.
all right. We have talked about the application of the Trump Doctrine to Greenland. We've talked about it to Panama Canal, we've talked about it, to the drug cartels in Mexico. Three areas that have definitely come up as concerns for the Trump administration. If you want to talk, if you wanted to learn more about what we talked about with Canada, we did a whole episode on what that would look like. But now we're going to engage in our favorite part, wild speculation. So now we're saying that for some reason, there's some sort of catalyst we can't even imagine. But Donald Trump in the United States decides, you know what? We're going full empire on this one. And the United States is just going to apply its military strength in order to achieve, again, to make it, not just to make America great again. We're talking glory of Rome. We're making America glorious again and engaging in manifest destiny in ways that we haven't engaged since the initial westward expansion. So, in your greatest fever dream, and I think I'm going to save Tina for last because I think hers might be the most epic and potentially terrifying. Christian, what is your Marcus Aurelius? What is your Trumpicus Maximus? you know, um, new expansion of the American Empire. What is it?
I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I can say, right? Greenland,
Hey, you've had
Canada,
time to think about this, man. You get to just answer now.
Panama. I mean, look, if you just go full empire, there's nothing that physically prevents the United States from taking Canada, taking Greenland, taking the Panama Canal, taking Panama itself, imposing its will by force of arms on Mexico, right? Like occupying it, turning that into a 20-year year long,
Nation building
new
exercise.
forever war. No. It doesn't even need to be nation building, right? You just like, I mean, we've invaded Mexico before, and I'm not just talking about the Mexican American War. I'm talking about the Pancho Villa expedition, right?
Yeah.
Look, you want to put a stop to Haitian migrants coming to Ohio. You
Yeah.
go to Haiti, and Haiti doesn't even have a government. I mean, you could take it over in an afternoon, and then you impose Singapore-style laws on Haiti, and you can get Port-au-Prince. You could get I would say the trains running on time, but the Haitians disassembled their rail network. So like that's actually true, by the way. But like,
We've actually been to Haiti now, and Royal Caribbean's occupation of Haiti was quite
yeah.
nice.
But like the point is that there is nothing stopping the United States from like taking the whole Western Hemisphere more or less and imposing its will, whatever that will is. The question is whether or not that's in our interest, because even though I am probably certainly more aggressive when it comes to foreign policy than libertarians, I am far less aggressive than some of the other people that I've seen who have been commenting on this stuff lately, because I align more with Bismarck than I do with.
Well, look, Christian, at the end of this, we're going to let you explain what your actual foreign policy is. But for right now, start wildly speculating, or I'm going to go to Tina.
Okay, fine. The wild if you go whole hog,
Yeah.
the wild speculation is you don't even invade Canada, you disassemble Canada internally, right? You instigate. Here's what you really do. You instigate a
Oh,
trade
no.
you instigate a trade war with Canada with the explicit intention of not negotiating a better agreement, but destroying Canada's economy and forcing the hand of the separatists in Quebec to declare independence, because independence is preferable to staying a part of Canada economically. That's always been the thing that prevents Quebec independence, which is, oh, we lose the market. Well, if you destroy the market, you remove the last pillar that keeps Quebec part of Canada. You do that, you force the Canadians to impose retaliatory tariffs on energy, which then brings about the question of national unity that is increasingly growing within Albertan politics. And you use economics to dismantle Canada. And once you dismantle Canada, it's very easy for you to go to the Albertans and say, hey, you get to avoid all the tariffs if you join the United States. It's very easy for you to go to the Quebecis and say, hey, declare independence and we'll recognize you. And then we'll reconnect access to energy. And then you disassemble Canada not through military force, but through economic force with the explicit intention of acquiring Canada. You can leave the question of Quebec open, because I think that even in a full empire situation, we probably wouldn't want to directly own Quebec. But
Yeah.
the point being that you don't even need to invade. You don't need War Plan Red. You don't need to invade Canada to disassemble Canada. The United States already has, if it really wants to, the economic means to disassemble Canada politically from within. The next
Yeah.
thing you do is you go to Mexico and you basically
Connor
say,
approves, by the way.
See, I know a lot of right-wing people in Canada that would very much disapprove because they'd be horrified of the idea of joining the U.S. But like again, if the U.S. wanted to go full imperialist, if they wanted
Yeah.
a, and I don't mean the global American empire, the gay, I mean the American empire, right? The A. Like there's this fake. What? No, let's be honest. And you were bringing this up. I think
don't
at the
wanna be
beginning of
gay.
this at the beginning of this podcast, you were bringing up that like, look, the United States has been promoting wokeism.
Yeah.
You were talking when we did our podcast about the UK. You said that look, there's things about America's foreign policy where we are promoting wokeism, and I am very much against that. That's what the global American empire is. It's the neocon, neoliberal promotion.
Okay, but
of,
we're not that different episode.
Okay,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Can you
The
just
point-
get?
Get
the
back
point
on
is-
point.
The point is that you drop the global part of global American empire and you integrate Canada. You take Greenland because we already occupy it. You go to the
Right.
Panamanians and say, that's cute that you don't want us to have possession of the canal. We're going to take it anyway. You reimpose a government on Haiti. You just occupy the country. You don't annex it, but you militarily occupy Haiti and you make the country run on time. You basically impose martial law on the country and you run it like Singapore does. You'll get things, you'll get rid of the cannibal gangs real quick if you do that, right? Like you stage another Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, except this one's successful. And in this case, you could argue it's neoconservative because you're spreading an ideology, but you're not spreading it to then leave Cuba again like we did 120 years ago. You spread it to say now Cuba gets the Puerto Rico treatment, basically. And you could do that in a weekend, basically, because the Cuban military is a joke. And half the Cubans would probably welcome the Americans as liberators if we came in anyway. Like and then finally on the question of Mexico, I think it would actually be detrimental for us to annex parts of Mexico because it's a radically different culture. But no, you impose your will on Mexico as well, right? You engage in drone strikes and maybe a military incursion to break up the cartels, and you tell the Mexican government you're responsible for this. In fact, actually, I got a better idea. You replace the Mexican government with one that's more favorable to the American government. And then finally, on the last point, to that end, if you go full empire, if you drop the G part of the global American empire, what you do to NATO is very simple. You give them an option. You say you're going to have a UK or French or German equivalent of a First Amendment, and yes, a Second Amendment, or we're pulling out of NATO, and you can have fun dealing with the Russians. We will give Moscow a free hand all the way to the English Channel because we know that there's honestly nothing that you can do to stop them. And so the problem will resolve itself. Either these governments, hear me out, either these governments will stop being these left-wing totalitarians on their own people, or they will get post-liberalism one way or another. They will either get it internally or Russia will impose it on them. And I don't even think it will require a Russian invasion of Germany or any other country in Europe to get this to happen. I think that the governments within Germany and France and the UK would fall if the US pulled out of NATO, let alone if the US actually treated them as ideological opponents and enemies and said, no, there's no special relationship with Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer has to go. And the United States is going to do whatever's necessary to cause a collapse of the Starmer government, a collapse of the Macron government, a collapse of the failed traffic light coalition in Germany, because these are ideologically opposed to what we believe as Americans, and you are terrorizing your own citizens, and you are leeching off the United States. We subsidize you. How about we stop subsidizing you?
Okay.
I think that that's how it ends. And I disagree with a lot of what I said, except for that last point about Europe.
Yeah.
I do agree with that one.
Yeah. Okay, Tina, go ahead. Full
All right.
Imperium.
So, number one, we no longer do foreign aid at all. Everyone starts at zero, and then they negotiate what they will do in return for whatever we can provide. And it's got to be good for the U.S. And then on top of that, I think we annex everything from the Panama Canal up north, including Canada and Greenland. And I also want Bermuda because it would be a really nice East Hawaii. And then it'd be Northeast Hawaii. And then we take Cuba. We take all of that, like annex all of that.
So everything in the Caribbean.
We take Cuba. We take Jamaica. We take everything is ours now. They're all territories. And then we go ahead and we utilize our own military to go and clean up all of the criminal elements in all of those areas and clean it all up, spruce it up, make it nice, and colonize the crap out of the whole place.
Tina's like, I never want to have my passport to travel the Caribbean again because it's all ours. All right. Well, see, so Christian, do you see how Tina did that? Very like just straight to the point. Like,
I mean, Tina, you missed your chance to be at the Berlin Conference in the 1880s.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Hey,
All right.
the chat likes my idea for Northeast Hawaii.
Yeah. Northeast. All right. My turn. My turn. All right. So if America went full imperium, I think Tina's onto something with respect to the removal of all U.S. foreign aid. That's not to say that foreign aid wouldn't exist, but it would only exist in what was considered to be the direct strategic interest of the United States, and that would have to be very, very articulated, not this kind of nebulous sort of environment that exists right now. I think the United States would be uh, far more accepting of certain areas going to war or engaging in conflicts that we just perceived to not represent any sort of strategic interest of the United States. So there'd be a far more narrower definition of strategic interest in the United States. I think with respect to NATO, I think there's also a lot to be said there where it would essentially be like, look, you're more than capable of handling for your own security. I don't think actually Russia has the capacity to just simply take out Western Europe, but they would have to actually pick it up on their own. And I actually think Europe having to deal with its own threats would do Europe some good at this point because they become too fat and happy off of U.S. military dominance. Um, I think Greenland's just ours. This isn't even a question anymore. If we facilitate the referendum and it's ours, and everyone can pound sand. I actually think Christian talking about the way that would go down with Canada, that would probably be the most effective way to do it. You would essentially facilitate the separatist movements in French Quebec and the ones that already exist in places like Alberta. Then you would create economic conditions where it just simply made sense because there was no desire to remain unification. Then at that point, you would have various provinces that would fall into either. So I could see places like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, places like that potentially actually coming states within the United States, whereas you would have places like British Columbia and Quebec probably falling somewhere into the status of protectorates, which is to say that they would have a healthy degree of internal um, a healthy degree of an internal governance with respect to their own affairs without becoming part of the United States. Because quite frankly, we don't want them as part of the voting pool within the United States to determine our own president or U.S. Senate or anything like that. But they would essentially recognize the United States as the regional hegemon, and so in order to gain free trade status and access to energy and everything else with the United States, they can maintain a certain degree of internal autonomy, but um, there's no question of U.S. military or U.S. dominance within the region, and I think that would take place, especially in places like Quebec and British Columbia. Ontario would be an interesting use case. I don't see that becoming a state, but I could see it maybe long term. But in the meantime, probably a territory. When it came to Mexico, I
Nick,
think
I
what would
think
it?
I
Whoa,
gotta
whoa, whoa, whoa,
interrupt
whoa,
you.
whoa, 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 whoa! My turn, my turn.
I
When it
know,
comes,
but this episode is so full of sound bites that will be
yeah. Again, we're not saying this is what should happen. We're saying this is how it would happen if it happened.
nice
Uh,
caveat. They'll cut that out.
Yeah, I know, right? With respect to Mexico, it would with respect to Mexico, what I could see is the United States essentially annexing the northern portions of Mexico in order to secure our own borders and create kind of like a buffer area between the heavily populated of areas of Mexico, more toward the central and southern portions of the country, and the northern portions. You would also see the United States basically gaining access to the energy sources within northern Mexico. Southern Mexico would essentially operate as something of like a protectorate or a vassal, mainly because we don't want to incorporate the people there, and because we don't want to give it direct territory status. So it would still be allowed to run itself, but it would have to do so. Again, from a vassal perspective, it would be the United States would exercise a level of authority in order to make sure that problems within Mexico were not spilling over to the United States. But again, people in Mexico would not have the same sort of privileges that you would see within uh, like a territory of the U.S. So there would still be some separation of that. When it comes to the other countries within Central America, um, it would probably run. I mean, I could see it running something like this. Uh, Vassals would be, parts of Mexico, Honduras, Nicaragua, Jamaica, Haiti, Dominican Republic, so now we're going to the Caribbean as well. But these would be countries that, again, we don't want to give territory status to because that would allow for free movement within the United States. They would still, again, exercise a certain degree of autonomy, governing autonomy over their areas, but um, essentially having to willing to, or essentially being made to accept U.S. intervention when we deem it necessary for our own security. Um, and then, protectorates, again, Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Belize. El Salvador, Costa Rica, Belize. They're actually they've actually demonstrated an ability to be able to maintain control over their own country. So it would be they largely get to operate pretty much like they do now, but they would get the increased benefit of trade with the United States and a certain degree of security, not just externally, which they get right now, but also internally right now from the United States. So basically, what you're seeing right here is I'm essentially saying that the Caribbean, Central America, North America would all um, be under a degree of American control, uh, which is unprecedented up until this point. With again some aspects of them becoming full integration within the United States. That's where I see countries like or excuse me, places like Alberta and whatnot potentially getting full integration in the United States. The rest achieving some sort of territory or protectorate status, and then some of the more trouble spots achieving what I might call vassal status, which is to say that again they can govern to a point. They have to accept military, or excuse me, U.S. intervention when we perceive it to be in our best interests, and they don't get freedom of movement within kind of the greater American empire within that area. Um, I don't anticipate us really going into South America. I think that's probably a lot more trouble than it's worth. I think we'll probably stop at the Panama Canal and again various places within the Caribbean, and I think that would be the sphere of American like direct American intervention. With obviously the rest, we would kind of keep at bay through overwhelming military power.
And we are also going to take Northeast Hawaii.
I don't take Bermuda in this. I don't actually, even
I
on the
think
Caribbean
we
countries.
should
Wait a
have
second, let
Bermuda.
me finish. And when it comes to European territories in the Caribbean, I don't mess with those. We don't take those. We allow them to exist. Um, Cuba would definitely fall under. Cuba would become eventually probably become a territory of the United States. But like Bermuda, um, various like Dutch islands, French islands, they can remain in place.
Nope.
Well, and this is me, not you.
Those are ours
So
now.
so there you go. That's how I perceive. Um, if U.S. wanted to go full empire in the Western Hemisphere, I think that's how they would operate. Okay, now let's close out with out of all the various things that we talked about today, what sort of foreign policy do you actually favor? Is it the realpolitik? Is it the non-interventionist? Is it the isolationist? Is it the expansionist? What are you saying? Tina, you can go first since it'll probably be the most
You know, I don't.
shocking.
I want whichever one lets us put American interests first. Um, but I guess realpolitik with guardrails. I guess.
Okay.
Um,
Realpolitik.
like I think there would have to be some kind of structure in to implement it.
Mhm.
But definitely, I like that a lot better than going around and trying to make little democracies everywhere. You know,
So there you
if we're
go.
going to go somewhere else, I think we should have interest in doing so, and there should be a payoff on the other side for our country.
So I will say for me, and I'll let Christian go last, provided he promises not to do 47 caveats. But for me, I want the American baseline to be non-interventionist. So I want widespread trade, very, very little war or intervention. That's the baseline with a real politique application, which is to say that there will be times where the United States has to flex its military and economic muscle. And I feel like if the guardrail is non interventionist foreign policy, combined with Realpolitik, I think that makes the most sense, and it's the one that I would like to see applied. Christian?
I'll start with a quote.
Oh, here we go. Buckle up, everybody.
If there,
There once was a dream.
yeah, no.
Let me read this tweet.
Is it his own tweet?
Well, it is a tweet, but I'm not going to show it to people because it's just a quote.
Okay.
Yeah.
If there is no last-minute miracle to avert a war, it is destined to destroy, for decades to come, almost all of European civilization. That was Helmut von Moltke, July 29th, 1914.
Yeah.
Moltke was right. And his uncle, the more famous Moltke, Moltke the Elder, was also right when, over a decade earlier, he had predicted, and when he said, when the war that is for the past decade hung like Damocles' sword over our heads at last breaks out, its duration no one will be able to foresee. It might be a 7 years war or even a 30 years war. Woe to him who sets the match. And he gave that as a speech to the Reichstag in May 1890. And so people were predicting World War I a generation before it happened. There were people that were predicting it would destroy European civilization literally days before it happened, and they were right. I think that the danger of empire building, of Weltpolitik, of just, I'm going to take what's mine and everybody else can just deal with the fact that I have the military or economic force to do so, is that you create the circumstances through which people will come together to stop you eventually. And this is the problem that the German Empire found itself in the lead up to World War I, where it aggressively pursued its own place in the sun. It aggressively pursued world politics, which is what Weltpolitik translates to. And it basically was like, well, who's going to stop us? We already defeated the French once. The Austrians are a joke. The Italians are a joke. The Russians are backwards. And let's build up a giant fleet to contest the British. Let's go and acquire a bunch of colonies in Africa. Let's go flex our muscles around. And then lo and behold, when 1914 came around, Germany had one ally. And it was arguably the most dysfunctional state in Europe. And they were faced with everybody, linking arms to defeat them. Now, can the United States bully its neighbors into, imposing its will, right? If it goes full empire? Yeah, of course it can. But a day will come where if it does that, and it hasn't yet, but a day will come where if it does that relentlessly, the rest of the world will take notice and they will decide the United States is an enemy, and we will link arms to stop you. And stop you, the stakes are much higher than they were in 1914 because the stakes involve intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? It involves nuclear weapons. The point that I'm trying to get across is, for all of its flaws, and there are so many flaws, but for all of its flaws, the post-war liberal order was constructed for a reason. It was constructed to prevent a third world war. The reason that we have the global American empire of today that we hate so much, with all the neocon, with all the nation building, with all the exporting of wokeism, I despise all of that. The reason we got to this point, though, is because 80 years ago, we concluded that we cannot allow a third world war to break out because nuclear weapons exist now, and it would wipe out humanity or civilization. It would destroy the countries that participated in it. And so we created the post-war liberal order that was then re-solidified after the end of the Cold War. We created those things because we wanted to avoid repeating history. And I totally get the forces that are larger than anybody can control at this point. What the book, The Return of the Strong Gods, is alluding to, that was published a few years ago, where basically nationalism and populism and religion are going to come back as major forces that drive nations and drive policy on a domestic and international scale. I get that we're going back to the era of, great powers jockeying for control, and that we're returning to a kind of pre-World War type foreign policy. I get that the global American empire is dying, and I think that's a good thing. I get that we're seeing a return to real politics on the international stage, and I welcome it. But I also caution that it is not inconceivable one day, it might take a few generations, but it is not inconceivable to see that this transition away from liberal international politics to more realpolitik will one day open the door for people to say, well, why stop at realpolitik? Why not go full Weltpolitik? And that is a very dangerous thing that was intended to be avoided after World War II. And so I understand why we're walking away from that post-war mindset, but we should understand what comes along with walking away from that mindset. It's Chesterton's fence, right? Some of these fence posts need to be ripped out of the ground. We know it, but not all of them. And so, by all means, engage in America First foreign policy, but don't allow the America First foreign policy to indirectly, in 2 or 3 generations, sow the seeds for a calamity that we went through in the 20th century twice. And I do think that there is actually a concern that these forces that are revolting against modernity, revolting against liberalism, revolting against wokeism, will one day manifest in a type of nationalism, a type of foreign policy that is not just America first, or UK first, or France first, or Germany first, but is a form of nationalism that can indirectly fuel the type of circumstances that can lead to another world war or another calamity like we saw in 1914 or 1939. It's not right now. Right now, the issue is defeating the global American empire, defeating wokeism, right? Right? That's the issue right now. But I can see these cycles in a much bigger picture. And
So
that's
no,
the concern I have.
I think all of that is very insightful. I'm going to end it with this. So, what do you recommend with respect to your foreign policy? Like, sum that up, because like Tina and I both summed up. Like, I think this should be the approach with these guardrails. What's
So
yours?
so I think it's best defined as realpolitik. It's America first. It's explicitly America first, and we don't have that currently. We still have a liberal first foreign policy. And I embrace that. I want a foreign policy that puts the United States, its interests, its people above all else. But I understand that if we embrace that, other countries will also embrace the same thing for their country. And then you get conflict, right? Because America first and UK first might not mean the same thing, right? We know America first and China first are not the same thing, right? Because we disagree on things that could potentially lead to war between our two countries. And so, just in understanding that if you reject the liberal global order, however you reject it, you are inviting dangerous circumstances. I think you avoid those dangerous circumstances with a Bismarckian approach, one that you don't discard. That was the mistake Germany made in the late 19th or early 20th century. So I embrace realpolitik, but I also understand that that carries with it some dangers, and we just need to be aware of what those dangers are. But I enthusiastically embrace an America First realpolitik foreign policy as an alternative to the existing neocon, left-wing, liberal, post-war, post-Cold War order that has existed, because that order is fueling left-wing wokeism. And I think a realpolitik approach would actually go a very long ways to addressing not just foreign policy concerns, but also domestic policy concerns.
Okay. Well, listen, we've kind of gone through. I think we've tried to do our best to try to articulate what a Trump doctrine might look like, how it might actually be applied with some of the situations that Trump has recently pushed. The thing I'm going to close with here is kind of an extension of what Christian was saying, is that I do think that sometimes it can become very, very tempting when you're frustrated with not only where you are, but the various circumstances that led to where you are, to forget why some of those circumstances were put in place, and to at least respect that there were some good reasons for it. To Christian's point, when you go through 2 devastating world wars within a relatively short period of time, where where you have people that actually fought in World War One and World War Two and Korea, and then saw the Cold War. There's a reason why people were absolutely determined to try to create some sort of stabilized environment where not every country was seeking out whatever political leadership at the time thought was in their best interest. Why there were certain guardrails that were put in place, some sort of governing philosophy, which did put the guardrails on what could be construed as national interest and the appropriate application of economic and military force in order to achieve those interests. And I think some of that was really good. I think some of that actually made a lot of sense. It's the reason why, if someone were to ask me, what sort of foreign policy do I want the guardrail to be non interventionist. Our goal is not to expand. Our goal is not to conquer you. Our goal is not to intervene in your internal problems. Our goal is to protect our borders, our country, our interests. And insofar as we can trade and cooperate with you to where it's to mutual benefit, we're more than happy to do so. And otherwise, leave each other alone. But there can arise very real considerations where we do have to intervene because it is of a critical national security interest to the United States, not because some politician wants to make a name for themselves and certainly not to support a military industrial complex, but to recognize that not everything is as cut and dry as we might like it to be. There will be times where it makes sense for the United States to have allies. There will be times where it makes sense for the United States to engage militarily and economically in order to secure our interests. But I think if we can stick with an underlying philosophy that says pretty much what George Washington said, our desire is to be a friend to anybody that is willing to be friendly to us. But if you decide to be hostile toward the United States, if you decide to engage in conquest, which puts our strategic interest in danger, then you will be met with overwhelming force. Not because it's then our job to rebuild you or to turn you into a place that's, quote, safe for democracy, but to neutralize the threat, both to us and potentially to allies. So I think we need to get back to, again, a US foreign policy, which is non interventionist in nature, but willing to engage in realpolitik where necessary. So we hope you've enjoyed this. Obviously, again, talking not only about the foreign policy, but what would American imperialism look like? And I think what you've seen is that most of us, we don't really want that. We don't really want that, even though we recognize that it might be within the current military and economic power of the United States. That doesn't mean it's good long term, and it doesn't mean it's moral. And we want the United States to not only be the most powerful economy and military in the world, but we would also like it to be a just power. And we hope that that's what we will work toward achieving. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate all the comments, the questions, the insight on what sort of topics that we should address. We look forward to going back and looking at our community chat to see what sort of topics that we might tackle in the future. So again, if you want to be interested, if you want to be a part of that live stream, if you want to be a part of actually helping determine where the program will go and ensuring that we can continue to talk about things, even if we get kicked off of YouTube or something else for something we might say in the future or some sort of threat toward a foreign power that Tina might make, joining our, our intentional community is a great way to do that. So once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.